Hi everyone, my name is Christian DeCelle. This is the Logsdon Cave Survey Project presentation for the 2021 NSS Convention. Just a quick background before we get into it. Logsdon is an SCCI preserve, which means permanent entry, permanent exploration for survey, bolting, all that stuff. It's in Mammoth Cave area, Hart County, Kentucky, and the reason why it's interesting, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but the number one is that it most likely connects hydrologically or by passage to the Fisher Ridge Cave System, which is 130 plus miles if you haven't heard about it already. It's in the NSS news quite a lot. Here is where Logsdon is on the map. Logsdon and the other Fisher Ridge entrance are over in that pink circle right there. Fisher Ridge is on the east side of the map. The Logsdon/Fisher Ridge Spring is there in red. And then Mammoth Cave, which I think a lot of us know, is there in west. And again, this is in south central Kentucky in Hart County. So, a short history of Logsdon Cave. It was historically found and dug open. They thought it connected to Mammoth Cave maybe. They wanted to turn it into a tor or something, which is why the entrance looks like a mining facility. The project was then picked up by cavers in the 90s. And at some point along the way, it was purchased and donated to the Nashville Grotto by Bill Holliday. Big thanks to him. When they picked the project up, I believe they only knew about this passage that is on the east side of the map that was kind of small, and they started to break out into more and more stuff, and then all of a sudden it dropped through a pit and just started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They hit a room that they couldn't get across this traverse because at the other side was a tall, steep breakdown slope. So they got a crew to come in and go up there with a rope, and they traversed it. And they were ready for it to break out, and it just didn't. It died, and a lot of people went home. And then, of course, the surveyors kept on going. Peter Quick and all them, I believe all these guys were part of this group that then just popped through a little hole over here and found the whole rest of the cave. And they went down, down, down until they found the water way there down at the bottom where it disappears into a small hole. And that was the end of that survey effort and that effort. The cave lies almost over top known Fisher Ridge Passage. It's like less than 20 feet away in places. I've found that it's actually like straight through Fisher Ridge, the data at least, but it's at the end of a long passage that is just horrible digging, and that's where they thought it might have connected, but then instead of making the connection through here, they decided that it just wasn't going to be feasible or wasn't going to happen, and they dug their own entrance, which is now the quick exit. So I'm going to bring you guys through a little tour of what Logsdon Cave is like, just so you can go back when I'm talking about the leads and the exploration and have a better idea of what's happening. So on the left there is the entrance from the inside. On the right is the entrance from the outside. It's just a short 20-something foot pit. And it clearly used to have a roof because there's a bunch of these old dead speleothems inside. Then from there you go into the polar vortex, which is what we've been calling it because we were surveying it in the dead of winter, and it was maybe 15 degrees outside, and this cave just blows or sucks cold air in the winter. It sucks in so much air that you have ice down a couple hundred feet in, and once you drop into the main pit area where all the air is, it is just blowing fog out as it hits this warm air. So it's 40-foot low and awful crawl. Then you have the gate, which is this weird concreted rebarred bucket. And then you have a small room where there's a couple bats. And then there's a 50-foot damp crawl where you kind of crawl down at an angle. And then you have to pop through a couple squeezes, one of which is about 11 inches, maybe a little bit smaller. And it has prevented people from coming in the cave. This is one of the reasons why not a lot of people come to this cave. The entrance is just kind of awful. And this squeeze is really a preventer for a lot of people. And then right before you get into the nice passage, there's probably my least favorite part of the cave, which is the wet womp, where you have to kind of belly flop into the little tiny stream there and then lean up, and then you're in main passage again, where you can walk and drop the first pit. So the initial drops are, of course, the entrance pitch, which I showed. and then the Polar Escape, which is on the right after you do the Wet Womp. Then you get a couple big rooms. They're kind of all one big room connected. And then you got the J drop, which is a 35-foot drop that continues down. It's really about 50 feet, but then you kick across halfway down and go to a little ledge on the other side. And then you crawl in and you meet the twins, which are these 20 and 15-foot drops where you have to kind of crawl, get your gear ready, lock off, and then pop out over. That's another big pain, and it's very wet in this section. In those big rooms that I mentioned, there's some beautiful rimstone pools where throughout the exploration we've actually discovered some Acylidae, which are isopods, I believe, and then this other larva in those pools that look like Hellgrammites, if you know what that is. And I haven't been able to get them ID'd. I've asked some people and they haven't been able to tell me. So, pretty cool find. Then you get to the Traverse Room. After all those drops, which is, I think, the biggest room in the cave. Maybe the Pretty Room, which we'll talk about later, is bigger. But it is this large room where you come up a breakdown slope, and then it flattens, and there's lots of flowstone, and then there's just this big 60-foot pit that you can kind of traverse around the side, and there's a breakdown crawl or climb on the other side. The breakdown climb is what they historically climbed in the 90s and thought that they would break out into big passage. You can go down the big pit as well, and I believe this is what Gary Schindel told me is called Schindel Falls, because he almost died when he was rappelling off a stalagmite, and the stalagmite snapped, and he was caught by their backup boulder a little ways back. So that was the original exploration, I believe, and that was quite terrifying to hear. And I think I've seen the broken stalagmite now, and it started to actually repair itself and come back up again. So we wanted to survey this cave because the map we were given when we went in here ended right after where we got to at the end of the Traverse Pit Room. We had this map and it just showed that there was nothing else, but then we were able to push on and find more caves. So of course it was in our minds immediately, new cave, we gotta survey this. If anything, it's at least not on the map. It might be known, but we can come back and survey this. And this actually was right here on the real map that later on someone else sent to me, maybe Sean Lewis, and it shows that we were only really halfway through the cave. And that first trip that we did, we ended up going all the way to here before we met the 54-foot drop and did not want to go down their very old and scary rope that had been left there since probably 1995. So after you do that little traverse pit, you come into the break room, or whatever you'd want to call it, if you go through a little squeeze, and then there is immediately another tight squeeze right afterwards that is the tightest spot in the cave. And you see Josh Brewer squeezing through it on the right. This was not the original path, but it is now our typical route because the upper path you have to kind of climb up into, and it's a very tight slot that I don't have too much trouble with. Trace and my typical partner doesn't have too much trouble with because we are extremely thin, but we didn't realize that if you are not insanely thin, it is very, very tight. So we widened this lower passage by just dropping the floor a little bit. There was some rocks in it and it was not that hard, and we were able to get pretty much everybody in. So after that, you are in the gorgeous Sand Canyon, which is on the right. It is this beautiful canyon with sand on the bottom, some water coming in from the far side, and some flowstone and some nice stuff up there that we did end up trying to climb and check out. There is a small lead up there, but it just peeks back into the Sand Canyon from where Trayson is. And then on the left, that is the Pretty Room, which you get to after you go through some crawls, like a little canyony area, fissure area, after the Sand Canyon. So this is a 54-foot drop, and it comes into a very pretty room with a little gallery over there. And in a second, I'm going to point out a lead.
Is that a lead there, Trayson?
Where?
Right there.
Oh, it looks like it.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to that in a little
interesting.
bit. And that's the area where you then go to connect
That's where the passage
to the final
continues.
area of the And that'll be the end of our little tour through the cave, and you'll hear me talk about the very end.
So we're here, almost in the final room of Logsdon. This right here is the final drop. Look at that sweet rigging that's been here since like 1990. Should probably get rid of that. Over here is the Nashville Grotto dig leads, which are
not
basically
related
at
to the
this
Nashville
elevation
Grotto
that
at
I'm
all.
at, but over there you have to climb to get it. So this drops down maybe another, 10, 20 feet down?
That's the
bottom,
drop you
maybe
see on the
30.
right.
Trayson and Corey, they took their gear off right here and went up there. It's kind of a tricky climb. You have to jump and belly flop. I attempted to do it and I slid all the way back down and hit the ground, so I don't feel like doing it again right now. I've done it before, but they basically go up there, curve around, and then they appear outside this room with a big drop on the side of them and pop into a little canyon, which opens up to Trayson's hellacious leads.
And those leads we will talk about later on in the presentation. That ends up being one of the coolest. So, what's still promising about the cave? Obviously, the leads. I just showed you one of them. The Nashville Grotto dig leads are the other one. That is the one that's incredibly close to Fisher Ridge. But there's also all of these other unknowns on the map that are just left as leads. The geology and the morphology, they are telling us that this cave could open up into anything at any moment. The cave is generally controlled by these chert beds where the water flows along the chert, creates these lower or kind of wider passages, and then it busts through these chert layers and creates these big pits in these large rooms that then they create the rooms as the chert migrates backwards. Because of this, you'll see that there are lots and lots of low, flat crawls that then will open up into pits and large rooms. And there's also lots of high leads because of those streams that are now dropping down waterfalls into the pits. They also continue up above in high leads at the other side of the room. There is some more depth potential for the cave. It's currently at about 230 feet of depth, which is actually almost exactly what the old surveyors found as well. And it can go maybe 60 more feet down until we hit basically the Green River. And of course, the most promising thing is that we wanted to connect to Fisher Ridge. It is our end goal, and we are infinitely excited about it always, even though all of our leads and everything doesn't seem to want to pan out, and it does not want to give it to us easy, but we'll see. The first blockade in the cave was really re-rigging it. The cave, and think back to the really tight entrance, doesn't like you to bring things into it, i.e. ropes and rigging and heavy things. It's very annoying and not fun, but we had to re-rig basically the whole cave. There is tons and tons of stuff that is just old, which you can see over here. There's lots and lots of stuff that just has really bad galvanic corrosion, which you can see a perfect example of right here. Even the people who came back later, probably in the 2000s, maybe when the SCCI took over the lease for this cave, I believe somebody came in and put these Petzl long lives in, but then put these quick links on that are not stainless and created this issue. There's pitons that get used, specifically the piton of death, which I hate, and I have replaced with bolts because it terrifies me that anybody was going over this horrifying pit on this single piton, which I may have actually knocked out because it was already so loose. And then, of course, the fixed rigging on kind of sketchy flakes in the wall that has also been replaced with nice bolts where we have rerouted the drops so they are not in things like waterfalls. So, coming into the leads, the first lead we did was this one at the beginning of the cave, which is pretty high up, and it was just a low crawl. You can kind of see here average height was maybe 5 feet in the beginning, and then the back half was maybe 2 feet, maybe 1. When you see the sketch stops here, that is when things got much more difficult, and my sketcher quit out on me, so I need to go back and fix that later. The high lead in the traverse pit room, we also took a look at. We don't believe it's too promising. It could go up into some room or some upper passage over there, but I think it just connects over back into the end of this room. Again, not really sure, but it is quite the effort to get up there and not really what we're focused on right now. The first big breakout of the cave was the traverse pit drop. We went down there and it was previously marked as just a tight lead. And we think people have actually continued beyond that tight lead a little ways, but we hit a canyon that I assume is what they stopped at because it immediately gets really tight. There's this fissure passage that is maybe average of 1 feet wide, and you have to kind of crawl through the widest part of it, and it drops like 5 feet down to the river or the stream, and 10 or 15 feet up to the ceiling, and you're kind of going up and down and navigating through it. And it actually got to the point where my buddy Trayson, who was with me, who's about 6 feet tall, could not continue because it was so tight, and you have to do this terrible bend around a huge rock. That's really a femur constriction. That is the point that needs to be small on you, is you need to be short and have small femurs because you need to twist and drop so sharply. I continued down that without Trayson and followed it all the way until I started to hear water, got really excited, and then popped out in the final room of the cave where I already knew about. So it was a little disappointing, but also really promising. It showed us that they had not pushed this cave as hard as it could have been, because I don't believe that anybody has been back in this area here. There was no signs of it and definitely no survey there. There was also another good breakout that wasn't surveyed but had been visited previously, where back by the Sand Canyon on the south side, there's a high lead that you can climb up to and squeeze through a generally low passage that then is bolted, probably about 15 years ago, judging by the kind of bolts that are there. And there is a 55-foot drop there, which Trayson has dropped down on the left that you can see. And we took some time and surveyed that and found actually, and after rigging, that it drops back into the pretty room, which we hadn't even seen this lead before. Once we were in the pretty room, Trayson decided to do his swing of fate, or swing of faith, where he swung across to this high lead that was about 10 feet up, but you just couldn't climb to it. And he managed to cling to the wall like a cat and then traverse over and found that it did not really go anywhere. It just looped back down underneath through a smaller passage that we could hear him through and see his light. Now if we go back to where the water is going, I'm going to play a video on the right that you can see of Trayson in the final little crawl where you can see where the water goes, right at the bottom of the waterfall. You can see he pulled out a bottle of whiteout, which we were very excited about because we had dropped that about 3 months before, way back in the Traverse Pit canyon area, that lower spot, and we're never able to retrieve it because it was down in the stream where it was too tight to get to. You can see that's the lowest point in Logsdon is where that water is flowing right now. And we believe that that's going to, hopefully through to another pit to drop down and open up into bigger passage of the main drain of the cave. You can see that chert layer there, which is kind of controlling things. So the hydrology of the area is kind of interesting because it's not super well understood where the groundwater is going. This square there is where Logsdon Cave is, and you can see the mile 205.7 spring and the Sud spring. Their basins are not super well delineated. There's been very few dye traces, but you can see Logsdon essentially lies on the line between these two dye traces and where they expect it to go. I believe, and I think the Fisher Ridge cavers also have confirmed maybe that water in this area is going towards mile 205.7. If that's true, mile 205.7 is at an elevation of 433 feet, and our deepest point of Logsdon is at about 500 feet, which leaves us with about 67 feet of play, which might mean that there is a main trunk down another 20 or 30 feet that is then feeding straight towards that spring. I believe that on the Fisher Ridge side of things, they've also been wondering and looking for a lower base level passage with the main stream in it. We're 9,000 feet from Logsdon to the mile 205.7 spring. So there is a lot of potential for Logsdon still. So now we'll get into the final back of the cave leads that is the truly promising stuff. One of the things that makes this area so promising is that this is where we get close to Fisher Ridge. You can see on the screen there, the two circled things are our leads, and the one on the right is actually touching Fisher Ridge Passage. And when I've gone and looked at their actual data that they've given me, they are touching. They, in fact, go through each other, both horizontally and vertically. I'm pretty confident that the location of my cave passage is very precise and not off. It's probably not off by more than 10 feet, probably less than that. The Fisher Ridge stuff, though, it's so hard to tell how accurate it is in space. Probably pretty accurate, but over 30 years since it's been discovered, I can only imagine how much survey error might just occur naturally, especially since the closest entrance to this point is quite a long ways away, hours and hours of caving. And from this point to the original entrance of Fisher Ridge, I think is like a full 18 hours or something incredible like that. So the Fisher Ridge passage I have overlaid there might not be perfect. Even so, I think we're pretty confidently within the right area. At least all those little leads that you see coming down towards my cave, I believe at least one of those is trying to connect to Logsdon. The continues forever lead you can see on the left here, that one is interesting because it's paralleling the Fisher Ridge passage, but also heading towards a ridge that is far over in this area. I don't expect to pop out into anything large, but it is possible that we get to the other side of the ridge, or the valley, find this other ridge, and then we have, maybe some massive trunk Fisher Ridge style passage. I don't think that will happen, but you never know, and it keeps me wanting to go back. So, the lead that is super close to Logsdon and Fisher Ridge is the Nashville Grotto dig leads. These are not related to the Nashville Grotto. I thought they dug it originally, but it was actually just the original surveyors and those guys. As I said before, I think it might connect here because these passages almost touch, but I've actually seen the survey data for this passage right here, the sketch, and that looks almost exactly like what you see at the end of the Nashville Grotto dig leads. And at the end of these leads, you can tell from me on the right after going through it, it is very wet and muddy. I sat in those leads and at the very end in a tube where I am very small, and I had to basically jam my arms against my body, slide in there, and I had one arm sticking up in front of me, and I would kind of dig with my fingers, and I was able to just kind of drag stuff back, and then I would shimmy backwards and just keep dragging it and bringing it back, and then I would go back up, and I would continue to do that. I did that for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, before I got freezing, and all the blood refused to stay in my arms anymore. In that hour, I got maybe 3 feet, 4 feet, but I was confident that I was headed the right direction. There is a lot of air coming through here. And right before I left, I actually smeared the walls with mud so that if I come back on the Fisher Ridge side, which I hope to do in the fall, I can actually look at this passage and confirm that yes, this is what I saw from the Logsdon side. The other really interesting lead is the Lawler extension that we think might be heading over to the other ridge. It's paralleling Fisher Ridge Passage, and we know for sure that no one has ever found it because the way Trayson got up to it is kind of insane. He climbed up this flowstone and managed to get across here, which is almost impossible if you are not 6 feet tall. It is very, very difficult. I struggle a lot with it and have since rigged it because as I said earlier, I have to jump and belly flop onto this rock here. And it's now slick enough that I can't do it anymore because if I just slide right on back down because there's no friction here and have to kind of jump off and hit the bottom. It is not fun to do, but it is now rigged with a rope. After you do that, though, you have to climb up and around on this flowstone, and you get to an area where there is a drop into the final room right above the Nashville Grotto dig leads. And on the left, there's a little ledge that you can walk across. And Trayson did that and then popped into a tiny hole that looked like absolute nothing. I would have looked at this hole, and I think just about anybody would have, and just said, that does not go anywhere. This is not promising. But Trayson doesn't think like that, and he's the reason why we have all the leads we find in this cave. It ended up going, and it pops out into a series of small rooms that have clearly used to have some water flowing down them, the little domes, and then it disappears into a very tight canyon, which I believe I have there on the right. This canyon goes and goes and goes, and it gets too tight even for Trayson to continue after it starts cutting really sharply. And then I was able to wiggle down in and move a little bit further and get to this point you can see on the right, where it is. This is about the widest point where you can get to right there. And I can kind of just squeeze and squeeze on through. It's very tiring. There's a slot in the bottom, so you can't really touch the bottom. You can't really move forward. You have to wedge your arm in there, like arm bar it, and then slide forward and wedge your arm in again. And this whole time you're trying not to have your body just slide down and get jammed in that slot below you. So it's pretty big, and it will keep going, and I will be pushing it this fall with Trayson, but it is also very arduous. You can see Trayson on the left there after we had pushed this far and come back, and he was quite ready to sit down and relax. Down below, you can see my 3D model of Logsdon Cave as it stands, and you can see at this point we are down beneath the valley floor, and that canyon that we are in is ignoring all surface topography and cutting deep below it. That water is not coming out in a spring in this valley or even the next valley over. It is headed straight towards the Green River. The depth we are at does not show up until you basically hit over towards the Green River. You can see in the top there, that is our final surveyed point, and that is about 100 feet, maybe 200 feet, probably 200 feet from where this picture was taken. So this is going to go out maybe to here so far, and we know it's continuing. So as a final review, the cave length we've got is 2,819 feet currently. That is up from the original survey, which had maybe around 14,000 feet on it. The cave depth is 203 surveyed feet, but that doesn't include the final drop into the waterfall room because we just haven't gotten around to surveying it yet. And on the right there, you can see all of the new sketch that we have added to the old map. That is all of the stuff that was never included on the map, and some of it which was never known. I want to thank everybody who's been coming along on all of my trips, all the surveyors. You guys are awesome, especially you, Trayson, who has come back day after day after day when it is 20 degrees out and jetting into the cave. I also want to thank the SCCI for pretty much running access to the cave, the Nashville Grotto for owning it and helping the upkeep all the years, and Bill Halliday, thank you so much for buying this amazing cave and giving us this opportunity to go in it so many years later. Thanks everybody for showing up to my presentation. I hope you all have a great convention.